Alright, another draft physics video presentation. No comments on the last video. Cool. No rational ones anyway. A conversation with Rob Reed on quantum mechanics and many worlds. Sean Carroll. So we'll do that. Yeah, it's just so stupid. It just overtly lacks any. I mean, it just demonstrates to anybody who's done has any kind of contextual knowledge of physics and the experiments that have been done, just how bad conventional physics is. The talking head physics, the whatever, the one they stick the microphone, the people they stick the microphone in front of, they really don't know what they're talking about, and they demonstrate it when they're talking. You can just, it just doesn't make any sense. They have a theory, they admit it's broken, and yet they say it's the most spectacular theory in the history of mankind. It invented penicillin and invented heels on shoes. It's the exaggerations are just grotesque. And again, they admit it doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't fit in terms of it's got all kinds of issues that can't be resolved, that people like Einstein went to their grave finding unacceptable, that needs an answer. So I just wrote down stuff. So this is the even worse version of quantum mechanics, where because some idiot has an imagination and can come up with some silly thing like flying pigs, because I can imagine flying pigs, therefore flying pigs exist. And that's where many worlds comes from. It's some idiotic notion that to solve a little bit of a problem with this whole entanglement nonsense being a reality, well, the simple solution is just to create multiple universes and just say there's a new universe for every event that takes place in the universe, and it's just made up. There's absolutely no evidence that the universe really works that way, and there's no evidence for the premises that caused them to go in this direction in the first place, which is all this nonsense about how objects don't have positions and velocities at the same time. That somehow they don't know where they are. No, we don't know where they are. We don't have detectors that can glean the information. That's all there is. That's all there is here. So the whole foundation of quantum mechanics is the idiotic notion that the human, whatever that word is for just human obsession, where they're saying because we can't detect where they are, they must not be somewhere, because we must be able to detect them, even though they can know that the rules of the game are is that there's things that are really, really small, that you don't have any subtle way of knowing where they are and what they're doing, because they're really small and you don't have any ruler, any instrument you can fiddle with them with to tell where they are. Because the only way you tell where something is to poke it with something, to do something to it. It has to do something to you, or you have to do something to it, but you have to cause an interaction. And yes, we understand that as you get more elemental in the universe, the smallest bits are going to be very hard to see, because we're not going to have any tools to interact with them with. Because you have to interact with them with very small tools. Now we can know that logically, that's the simple answer, and yet what do? For no good reason at all, they pretend that no, that's not the right answer. The right answer is they're hiding from us. They're tricky and clever, and they're manipulating the universe with a bunch of wooey behavior. They're doing all kinds of strange and bizarre things. So I've said this in the simple terms. The simple terms is they're expecting us to think it's reasonable, to make this assumption that there's no such thing as something we can't see. And of course there are things we can't see. Of course there would be. It's a logical consequence of doing physics. It's just the rules of physics. It's just so stupid. I wrote down some notes as they were talking, but I mean, look, the basic idea is we're trying to find out understand why things happen. And my simple argument to you is, if you listen to their explanations, they're silly on their face, as I just pointed out, as I just illustrated, and they're preposterously unevidenced. And so I'm going to play the part where they're talking about why they believe this crap, what evidence caused them to believe this crap. And you'll see it overtly done again, where they can't recite the history correctly of the evidence, and they cite evidence that doesn't exist, experiments that never took place, and they keep doing it. And no one's going to stop them until people like you quit saying, 227 thumbs up to 5 thumbs down for a video that's just absolute babble and nonsense. If you just keep doing that, you keep rewarding it, they're going to keep lying to you. So it's not really their fault. It's the audience's fault. It's you people listening who demand nothing better than this. The puros and the rest of you assholes who take no accountability for how badly evidenced this mush of a theory is. It's so it's just so bad. I can't. It's just amazing that dissidents are treated so shabbily for pointing out that this is just a garbage theory, and any other kind of garbage can't be any worse. Now, I'm obviously not advocating for accepting silly, also made up and unevidenced theories, but this is bad. And then they I've said this before too. I mean, they steal the word superposition, which really had to do with how different forces or different things that are creating, like 4 light bulbs in the room, they have a superposition. The light doesn't add up in some physical way. Like one light bulb's photons don't mix with another light bulb's photons and turn into double photons or something. They each just produce their light, and you can just do simple math to add up what the force would be. So if one's plus and one's minus and one's, if you have a +3 and a -2 and a +1, you just do the math and you'll figure out what the force is in some location, because there's no mixing, there's nothing complicated happening. That's what superposition meant in the past, and now they've got its meaning. No, things don't have a position. They're somehow, any one of these positions, or some kind of crap like that. So anyway, this all just has to do with the fact that we can make generalizations, in the sense we can understand some of these things as a mass. So it's like if you have a camera in space, you might be able to see all of New York City as a thing, and you might be able to understand some things about the individual humans in New York City, but you really can't zoom in on a single person or a single car in New York City. So you just say there's average things that happen. This is what happens in New York City, generally speaking. And that's the best you can do. And that's perfectly understandable. But again, they're arguing that no, it's not us that has a bad perception or a bad view. It's that New York City isn't made of individuals, and New York City isn't made of things you can zoom in and on. And that somehow zooming is impossible because we can't do it. And it's just terrible. All right, anyway, so I'll play this, and then I'll illustrate some things where necessary. So this is where they start to talk. So after they're setting up this conversation with preposterous hype that without quantum mechanics we would have nothing, we'd be sitting here with a rock, and we wouldn't have buckets, we wouldn't have anything without quantum mechanics. It's just a silly premise, just stupid hype, and the most proven theory in the history of mankind, or some other kind of nonsense, just made up nonsense. And so now they're getting into a conversation, and then they glanced at the idea of the many world solution, but now they're going into the conversation about the foundations of it. They didn't even overtly say, let's talk about why we believe this shit, but this is basically why they believe it. And It's the same crap that I've pointed out is crap. It's not good reason to believe.
Basically represent the shape of the slit. The pellet has to come in on a trajectory that makes it through the slit. So let's say they're paint pellets and you have a big old canvas on the other side, you're going to have two rectangle-ish looking shapes with a little bit.
So they're doing the same bullshit where let's compare throwing cats through a slit to comparing to electrons and photons. So electrons we know are charged elements, complicated, and certainly we know that when we throw a cat through a slit, there aren't other cats, that make up the slit, and those other cats don't have they reach out and grab the cat and all that kind of stuff. So we know when photons and electrons are interacting with a slit, it's a completely different thing that's happening because the stuff they're interacting with is fundamental to their function in the sense that it's made of protons and electrons are fundamentally interactive with photons and electrons. Obviously electrons. But let's just pretend we can do these kind of analogies, which are silly. I mean, a physicist should know better. A physicist should know that there's no such thing as hard surfaces, okay, in the tiny world. The tiny universe just really doesn't do hard surfaces. They're made of atoms made of electrons. I mean, come on. Mostly empty space. Remember that? I mean, hell.
The scatter pattern around them.
Exactly right. Whereas, if you take your two slits and put them in a tub of water and slap one side of the water and let the waves move out in a circle from where you're slapping, the wave can pass through either one of the slits.
Right. Now, if they did that analogy with the single slit, using the single slit as an example because it produces the pattern, well, the water example doesn't work. Because if you slap the water and it goes through the single slit, it creates one wave and there's no interference. So the analogy completely fails. And then if they do the analogy with multiple slits, it'll again completely fail because there's images at the different locations.
It breaks into two waves.
And they will either constructively interfere, so they build up even higher than any one of the waves themselves.
So let's understand, photons don't do that. Photons don't go all the double on, double off, whatever double off would be. They don't do that. They don't do this double on off thing. Okay, so they don't take a straight line of 1 1 1 1 1 and turn it into 2 0 2 0 2 0. They don't do that. That's not what they're doing. So why are you saying that's what they're doing? They land as individual photons with one photon of energy. They don't land as double photon. So again, this is completely debunkable as logic. It doesn't work logically, these statements they're making. It's really not consistent with the evidence. The wave pattern is creating a completely different pattern. It's an on-off pattern, literally on-off. Not just on-off in different locations. I mean, it's literally more intensity in terms of the amount of energy isn't consistent. There's not some bar that sits there and stares at you and says there's a bar there. No, there's agitation there. There's on and off there, where the other spot has nothing, neutral, no wave.
Two peaks hit each other and become a super peak.
Or they can destructively interfere so that where one is peaking, the other is troughing, and they cancel out and you get nothing.
So you end up with...
So photons don't do that. And clearly the photons that were going to one location go to where the bars are. So the slits don't destroy half the photons. That doesn't happen. Half the photons don't not get to the target. So again, the photon is clearly being moved from one location to another location. It's not being destructively interfered. It's not being destroyed. So all of this rhetoric has nothing to do with being accurate or factual or making a sensible argument. This is crap. If you did this at a trial, if I pulled this crap of this bad analogies at a trial to try to convict somebody of a crime, everybody would say, no, you can't do that. Okay, you can't come up with some fairy story about how a 6-foot person is really a 5-foot person. I can make it work. No, they're not the same.
The semi-regular pattern of high amplitude and low amplitude.
That's right. It's middle of the other side of the slits. You'll see a big peak, and then you see littler peaks fading as you go further away from the middle.
So a very, very different pattern on your canvas than you would have.
Right, and something photons don't do. The individual photons don't fade. All of that crap. So there's just fewer of them that are getting bent more dramatically, and that certainly seems intuitively sensible, that the more bending, the fewer of them that are enduring more bending. Okay, that makes sense. No intensity issue.
Had with the pellet gun.
Yeah, that's right. So then you try it with electrons.
You shoot the electrons one at a time.
Let's just shoot the electrons one at a time. Why not? The point is you do...
Why not? Like, it makes no difference to the experiment when it's fundamental to the logic here. Frankly, they haven't done this one at a time electron thing as far as I know, so that's just horseshit. But anyway.
You detect them one at a time on the other side. You get a little splat, particle-like, because when you observe electrons, they look like particles, right?
Yes, when you observe photons, they look like particles. That's right, they land as a clump, as Feynman would say. Feynman would say they're not a wave. He overtly said it. He's one of the fathers of quantum mechanics, and yet they think they're smarter than Feynman. They think Feynman was wrong, and they won't even say that. So their own quantum mechanics, they've already killed. It's like they said Moses is full of shit. Okay, and they've erased Moses from the frickin' Bible of their quantum mechanics. It's that kind of religion where they just, whoever's empowered just starts editing the book and editing the history.
But you do this for many electrons, but one at a time, like you said, and you observe the pattern of splats, and you might think that they look like two slits, just like the classical pellets did.
So I think I'll pause here and draw, just because I want to make this distinction. Look, the two patterns aren't the same. Electrons and photons don't create the same pattern. So this is just more of the, let's just forget about being accurate and being honest to the truth and being scientists with lab coats and without dirty fingernails and all kinds of, let's forget about the experimental process. Let's forget about being anything called clinical or exact. And this is the foundation of their theory. So all of this lack of care over details that are fundamentally very important, and they just slough over them. They just whitewash over all of the details that don't fit with their conclusion. And it's just so obvious. And for people to defend this over and over, so many of you to defend this bad science, it's just rubbish, crap, shit as science. And here you are applauding it, saying, yes, that's the way to do good science. That's why you have a shitty world, is because you people have shitty characters. You believe something and you just don't care what kind of cheats you're going to use to make it happen. Make that the truth. You're just such dishonest people. All right. I believe all right, should be back. All right, so this subject of let's do the electron thing first, just to get it out of the way. So there's a pattern that's created by photons, and if you're at all honest, you'll recognize that the pattern is pretty much, isn't that convenient? Yeah, well, all right. It's just bars, and they have a pretty hard surface. That is, the transition from light to dark is dramatic in the sense that there's not much of a graduation. Then when you do the experiment with electrons, the whole thing gets much fuzzier. So the electrons create a very gradual light to dark. So that's probably not doing it. If I did it with little dots, you could get the idea. But it's like there's a lot of dots, a hard line. And the line gets much softer as you go out here. It's a little bit, little bit, little bit, little bit, little bit. All right, a little bit over here. All right, so the pattern is what the math says it should be, which is it gradually goes from light to dark. Now the photons don't do that. the two patterns are obviously different because the functions are obviously different. The two devices are not similar in any way. An electron is not a photon. Electrons are charged and big. Photons are not charged and very, very small. And it's like they're just ignoring that fundamental physics. All right, now for the rest of it. This thing erases fairly well when it's, they call it dry erase, but the real point is don't let the marker stay on too long. It gets harder and harder to erase. All right, so there's the experiment they keep talking about is this idea of the double slit. Okay, so you have an impediment in the middle, and then you have these two openings. Now, obviously, Newton did this 300 years ago by just using an aperture, a hole, and making it smaller and smaller, and he got rings. Okay, so you got a ringed pattern when you do it with a hole. And all this slit stuff does is just take a section of the ringed pattern. So there's nothing mysterious here. This is Newton's experiment, really. And they always talk about Young. Well, Young added nothing but doing this slit thing instead of the aperture thing. And there's just nothing miraculous about his additions to the experiment. Now, obviously, the other experiment is the single slit. And then you have multiple slits, which can be represented, I suppose, all kinds of, as almost the pattern itself. So you have multiple slits, multiple impediments. Now, a key thing to the math that they never point out really is that this really isn't about slits and their width and all that kind of stuff. It's about surfaces and their distance. And there's a consistency in the math by recognizing that that's all this is about, is the distance between surfaces. Because in the math, this is the key variable, the width of the impediment. In the double slit, they don't even pay attention to the width of the slits. And in the single slit, when they do the math, this is the key variable, the width of the slit. Now, the only thing these two things have in common is that this distance represents the distance between surfaces. So if you think of this as a surface experiment, then the math has a consistency, because the variable is just dealing with the distance between the surfaces. And I would argue that's because these are electrical potentials, surfaces. There's electrons on surfaces, and that's what's causing this phenomenon. Now, the thing that Sean Carroll is implying is that, okay, these two, let's just erase this bottom part for convenience. All right, so let's pretend the source of electrons or photons is coming from the top. And so in this single slit, they're pretending that there's some logical reason to understand that there's ends up being two waves here that come out, and these two waves overlap and cause interference. Now, there's no reason to believe that happens. There's no logical reason, and the experiment, when you do it with something that is a wave phenomenon, some medium, you just get one wave and no interference. Okay, just one nice little wave. So that's the truth. And then in the double slit, what happens is, from their perception, is that the single item goes through. So this was single photons. This is single photons. Single photon somehow goes through both of these slits. It creates these two overlapping waves again, and creates the bar pattern. So again, it's a bar pattern. It's supposed to be gradually on and off by the math says it's supposed to be, but it isn't. And again, this one also creates the bar pattern. Now, the only difference between these two patterns, single slit and double slit, is the double slit technically is more than one pattern. That is, the pattern has a section, and then it goes to nothing, and then it has a section, and then it goes to nothing, and then it has a section, and it goes to nothing. So it has two patterns built into the on-off pattern. And then what they totally ignore again is this multiple slit, which doesn't make any theoretical sense with one photon at a time going through multiple slits and then creating images. Now this one creates like the double slit, except these sections are even further apart. So the images are even further apart, and they end up being images of whatever went in. So if you send laser light through a little circle of laser, you'll get little circles. You send square light through, you'll get little squares. You send Donald Duck through, you'll get Donald Ducks. So it's obviously images that end up at these different locations. Images of essentially what went next to these surfaces is just being duplicated in different locations. So the light's essentially just being bent to a new location and at a very exact angle. And that's the clear conclusion you could draw here. And it seems quite obvious that the same phenomenon is happening here. These are just images of the light that comes through. It just bends. Some of the images end up over here, some of the images here, some here, depending on how much one individual photon got bent. But they always get bent the same amount, and so you can get an image here. Likewise, the single slit, obviously the photons are just going through and some of them get bent. Same principles involved. So they've made up this whole story, and they don't include, it's like doing the 3 pigs and all you do is talk about one pig. You talk about this 2 slit pig and you just ignore the other 2 pigs that are vital to the story. These other experiments are vital to understanding what these photons and electrons are actually doing. I've never even heard of the electron experiment, frankly, with the multiple slits. So yeah, we don't even have that. So anyway, so I'll probably be back to drawing some more stuff, but we'll get back to the conversation. And but the truth isn't anything like what they're saying it is, and that it's not a hard truth to discover. I mean, these are fundamental experiments, and yeah, I could get onto. Well, I'll wait till they say it, and then I'll get onto it. All right, back we should be. So, continuing.
They don't. They look like the wave pattern that you got when you put water through the waves.
So they really don't look like the wave pattern. That's just silly. The pattern's not the same. The bars aren't turning on and off. The amplitude isn't twice as intense, twice as bright, and then nothing, and twice as bright and then nothing. It's not the same pattern.
Even though they're shooting out one at a time, they ain't waves in the traditional way of thinking about it.
You wouldn't think that they were.
You wouldn't?
Yes, you wouldn't think that they were. First, again, you wouldn't think that they were because it's not a medium. We don't have any evidence that they do things like waves do, which is spread and get tired and get worn out. There's every evidence that photons do actually travel across the universe without spreading across the entire universe. The photons that hit my eye from something, the same photon didn't go to a whole bunch of different places, and it certainly didn't send waves to all those other places and then decide to retract all that energy and just go to one place. I mean, that's theoretically, it's almost insipidly too complicated and too strange to say that's how the fundamental universe works. Things shoot out a bunch of rays to locations they're not going. They pave roads to nowhere. They pave a bunch of roads, and then somehow when they decide what road is going to be the road they're going to actually have traveled, they tear apart all the roads they built. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Even if you're a Republican, it doesn't make any sense.
Think that they're waves, you're firing them one at a time, and over hundreds or thousands or however many you send out, they end up imitating this interference pattern.
So again, they keep saying it's imitating it. No, it's not imitating it. It's not an imitation. It's like saying a duck is imitating a platypus. It's silly.
Of waves of water going through as opposed to actual single pellets.
Every electron is interfering with itself, which is something that waves do, not something that particles.
And again, waves don't do that. They don't interfere with themselves. So just more crap. you regenerate a wave. When a wave goes into these surfaces, there's physics that happens, okay? The sides of the water molecules have drag with the surface and move slower. There's a reason the new wave is created. So again, there's nothing interfering with itself.
Which makes perfect sense if you think that electrons are really waves.
So again, if you think they're really waves in some kind of bizarre way where you don't understand how TVs work, how anything works with electrons, because electrons aren't waving from the cathode to the anode, and they're not taking every path possible inside the tube. None of that's happening. So why would you think they're a wave when they're nothing like a wave, when they're clearly a cannonball?
That you made an observation at the detector. So far, that's fine. But to drive home the weirdness, you can say what?
No, the silliness. To drive home just how preposterously silly we have been and will continue to be. Let's just ignore, and again, based on a complete perversion of the facts. I mean, it's not like they were careful and explicit about the facts. It's not like the facts said we have to believe this crap. They've chosen to believe this crap.
Well, what if I could measure which slit the electron goes through? Because if I believe electrons are waves, it had to go through both slits.
So again, it had to. No, it didn't. It didn't arrive that way. It wasn't admitted that way. There's just no evidence that electrons are admitted in every direction at the same time and that they choose a path. There's just no physical evidence that that ever happens.
Now I want to see which slit it goes through, so I'm going to put a detector there and measure, did the charge go through one slit or the other?
All right. They haven't done this experiment, so they just keep citing detector experiments. There's not one shred of evidence that anyone ever made the detector, everyone ever installed one, anyone ever took a picture of these detectors. There's no evidence that any detector experiment was ever done, especially on photons. No evidence that the experiment was done. None. You can't detect electrons because the only way we can see them is with photons, and if you hit them with photons, they move. So you can't see where they are because you'll move where they are. You can't do the experiment. They pretend they did it and that they got the results they claim. Now, isn't there something wrong with this? First claiming you did an experiment you didn't do, and then claiming the results confirm he's guilty. Isn't this like me showing up at trial with a fake gun I bought at the store and saying this is the gun that killed the victim, and, I put the guy's fingerprints on it? I mean, it's as fake evidence as you can get. 227 likes, 5 dislikes. Explain this irrationality to me. What the hell is going on with you people? Why is this explanation satisfactory? It's garbage. This is crap as physics. It's crap as it's even bad as religion. Religious people aren't this fucking dishonest. We did the experiment. You didn't do the experiment.
And you're expecting at this point that it's gone through both because it's a wave.
Except you've never observed half of an electron anywhere.
Right. When you observe it, you force it to be in one location.
Exactly.
Yes, it's more crap. When you happen to open your eyes, it happens to land where you're looking, or some kind of... It's just... Again, religion isn't this silly.
The electron will go through either one slit or the other. You will never observe it going through both slits. And...
You'll never observe it going through anything. You'll never observe it. So again, this is a lie. So he's clearly implied they did the experiment. He's clearly implying that the experiment demonstrated that, well, even when we can see the electron, which slit it goes through, then there's no pattern. Then the whole thing breaks down. They made that up. That didn't happen. They didn't do the experiment. They have no idea, okay, what the consequence of measuring which one, knowing what slit it went through, they have no idea. Now, the trick is we can sort of aim electrons. So why don't they just aim them? You know, why don't they force them through one slit and then force them to, so we already know what slit it went through without having to fiddle with it. We don't have to detect what slit because we already know where we aimed it. So again, this whole experiment relies on some notion that we can't aim anything. Now, photons are really hard to aim. People think a laser beam is, you know, straight line, parallel, all that stuff. It really isn't. So again, you're kind of stuck. You don't know whether the photon you shot went this way or went this way. I mean, yes, it can be within a small range of places it went, but you can't be sure whether you go through one slit or the other slit with photons sent one at a time. But as technology gets better and better, I think that range is getting narrower and narrower. So maybe it is quite possible now. But they're not going to do the experiment because doing the experiment would demonstrate that their entire theory is made of mush. Because guess what? The consequence isn't going to be that nothing happens. When you put photons through one slit or the other slit, what's going to happen is they're still going to be affected just like they are in the single slit. So all you'll do is take away the double slit pattern. You won't take away the single slit pattern.
When you look at the pattern on the screen on the other side, the interference has gone away.
So he just cited it as if this experiment took place. It hasn't taken place. It's just a lie. It's just fake evidence. It's just false, phony, fraud, shenanigans. It's just absolute fake physics. And again, it's applauded. And you people wonder why I call you assholes.
Now that you're measuring which slit the electron goes through, it acts in a purely particle-like way, and you get the same kind of pattern on the other side that you got when you shot.
You'll never get the same pattern as you will with a bullet, because they're not bullets. They'll always be refracted because they're going next to a surface that refracts. That's what surfaces do. So I've explained this also, but this isn't anything different than shining light down on a surface of water and having the light refract by the water. The water bends, changes the angle of travel of the light. Well, guess what? If you're going this way across the surface, close to the surface, the same thing happens. And you can almost think of it like the Earth. The atmosphere bends light all over the place, scatters it to pieces. That's why we can't do certain experiments. We can't see the blackness around the sun, the black space around the sun, because of all the light being shot and scattered all over the place. And the same thing happens if I shoot light across the surface of the Earth. I go through more and more of that scattering atmosphere, and I'll make the photons bend in all kinds of directions. The same thing is happening on the surfaces of atomic structure. The same phenomenon exists. Okay, I'm not going to say it's the same. There's not an atmosphere. But the fact is that surfaces have lots of electrons on them. Lots of material bits that are loosely connected. And so you are, in fact, traveling through a meteor field, so to speak, of interaction. You're traveling through a reactive atmosphere. When you shoot photons or when you shoot electrons near a surface, you're shooting them through an interactive atmosphere. Fact.
The classical Peloton through two big slits.
So again, as we were saying earlier, by looking, you have forced it into a position, and this is manifesting itself on the actual photographic paper or whatever is on the other side that's detecting the pattern.
So more crap. Again, there's no detectors. You only see photons by terminating them, having them hit an electron and create an electrical impulse, create a current, create movement between electrons. That's the only way we can detect them. There's no other way to detect them than force them to move electrons enough where we can see the movement. There's no other way. There's no passive way to detect an electron or a photon. That's what the fact they should say right from the start. There's no passive way to do it. You have to interact with them aggressively. to see them, to know they exist.
The landings. And when this was first discovered, I suppose that a lot of people thought, wow, does this mean there's something...
Let's understand. So they didn't say the word young here when this was first discovered. This was first discovered by Newton. Okay, Young added no information to the science at all. To any smart physicist, Young did nothing but take away the round part and make it a rectangle instead. He changed how it looked. He didn't change what happened. He didn't discover some new feature. Nothing. He added absolutely nothing to the knowledge database. And yet they always cite him. Oh, that's when the world changed. It shouldn't have.
Strange about consciousness. And the fact that we're observing this is having this clear impact on matter. And
so this is as bad as the Dr. Quantum religious video, okay, a video made by religious people, okay, to try to turn quantum mechanics into a God theory. He's basically citing their rubbish, that somehow consciousness has something to do with this, somehow looking at the results has something to do with this. This is an old story made up by religious people, and here there are professional physicists citing it as some sort of part of the physics history, that this has something to do with a conscious effort to see something, and somehow our consciousness is forcing the thing to exist. It's such a frickin' lie. And here they are talking about it as if this has some relevance to this conversation, when it's just completely made up. Never happened. Detectors were never recorded and not looked at. They were never unplugged. None of this crap ever took place, and yet they're citing it as part of the real history. 227 likes, 5 dislikes. From people who are supposed to be educated. I bet you half of the people that watch these stupid videos are college, they went to college anyway, whether they graduated, who knows. These are supposed to be people with some sort of reasoning skills. And yet they'll call me names. And people wonder why I have a shitty attitude. Yeah, fuck you. This is retarded physics.
It knows when we're looking and it knows when we're not, and it behaves one way when we're looking and it behaves another way when we're not.
Well, it was certainly an implication or a possible...
No, it wasn't possible. It wasn't an implication. It had nothing to do with any fact. There's absolutely no reason to even think it or to go there. None of it makes any sense. It's just like you're in a group of 10 people and you're talking about physical reality and you start talking about, well, things seem solid and there's gravity, and then somebody says, God done it. And you're saying that's a piece of information that anybody needs. No. That's not. Oh yeah, that was a real, factual experiment to demonstrate there's some evidence that a God done it. No, there's zero evidence that a God done it.
The direction you could go down, as soon as it became clear that making sense of quantum mechanics required separate rules for the act of observation or measurement.
Right, so separate rules for a circumstance where we know the rule is you can't do it. You can't observe, okay? You can't measure. All you can do is terminate. You can terminate electrons and you can terminate photons, in the sense that you can force them to have a serious interaction with an electron. You can force an electron to push against another electron. And as I attempted to point out, well, I'll point it out again, so I'll pause here for a little quick drawing. But, I mean, these are just facts of how things interact, and they don't pay any attention to what are fundamental differences in these things. And they talk about something that are all the same thing, but they want to turn them all into the same kind of wave. An electron is not the same thing as a photon. They're not the same, and even worse, they're certainly not waves. They're not the same wave. All right. So, as it pointed out, refraction of light is a pretty simple thing. You hit a surface. Ugh, come on. A surface, and the light bends. Okay, and that's fundamentally what we're seeing in these experiments is something's going somewhere and it stops going there and it goes somewhere else. And these angles are very specific and have very specific rules, some of which are part of Maxwell's crap. Now, what's happening in this interaction is clearly a photon, a small thing, is hitting a big thing called an electron. Okay, the electron is gaining some momentum and it's releasing the photon at the new angle. And so I'm not going to try to detail that process, but even the physicists would agree that's fundamentally what's taking place. It's basically a Feynman diagram. For a moment of time, the energy of this photon is in this electron. The electron moves much slower than a photon, but it does move. And at some point, it releases the energy back to the world, but it may not release it in exactly the same direction because the electron moved not straight. So electrons don't necessarily go straight. They go this way. And then when the photon, this energy is released, it's released this way because that's the way it's traveling. So that's sort of a simplistic explanation. But that's how photons and electrons interact. And that's what's happening when there's these surfaces, they're covered with electrons. The photon is hitting the electron is moving, not straight, and the photon is released at an angle in the experiment, and then it leaves the slit at the angle. All right, so now when you do the experiment with electrons, this simple explanation is that now electron is hitting an electron. Now, electrons are charged particles, okay, and that means they're effectively, as Maxwell would tell you, or Maxwell will illustrate with drawings, they're radiating lines of force, vectors of force. And so what's going to happen is, I would argue that these electrons are actually radiating photons, these little bullets. And so you could sort of understand that if I have a bullet maker, why isn't this working? I mean, this is just too stupid. What, I have to hold it upside down or something? No, I have to hold the damn thing an inconvenient way. So they're shooting little bits at each other, little balls, you know. And you could sort of understand as they get closer together, these little balls are going to bounce back and forth much more rapidly. So when they're far apart, this line ends up being a very long line. You're going to understand that it goes bang, 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 and then it goes bang, 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 bang. And each bang represents momentum in a direction to the electron. So clearly, as they get close together, bang, 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 high pressure, right? Lots of bangs. So they're forced apart. So the electrons don't ever hit each other. What they do is they start bang, 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 bang. The intensity of the pressure increases, and the electrons bend away from each other. And that's why the electron pattern, as pointed out before, creates a nice, the pattern is gradually on and off. You know, it gradually does everything because it's analog. This bend can be any angle. Okay? It's not as specific. It has a certain amount of tendency to be in a direction, don't get me wrong. You know, there's always a certain amount of energy. So these angles will tend to be strong angles, 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 15 degrees. They'll be in increments, but there's a lot more variability in the where it ends up. So these are important differences, not part of their story at all. Okay, yeah, they're talking to laymen, they don't want to add the details, but a lot of these conversations, they're supposed to be doing physics. And how much are you going to cut out? How many facts are you going to fudge over? And then say some generalization that this BB going the speed of light, remember this is going 3 million meters per second. These things are going 10 miles an hour. All right? I mean, there's a huge difference between these things. This thing is associated with being matter. This thing, the photon, is associated with being energy. They're different things. And you shouldn't applaud when they make those different things into the same thing, because that's just not true. No. Yeah, not yet. Sorry. mistake. Okay, now I'm back. So, continuing.
Without specifying what that meant, the door was open for someone to say, well, look, observers are conscious creatures. I bet that human consciousness has some effect on the wave function of the electron.
Now, I mean, this is a place they have no reason to go. There's absolutely no evidence that human consciousness has anything to do with any of this crap. It's just made up lies, garbage. It's clearly wooey religion. They clearly have apparently no fear of just overtly creating some sort of new consciousness religion. This is horrible science.
Electron that changes it when we observe it. And the double slit experiment is just an especially vivid demonstration of that idea.
It doesn't demonstrate any of it. It doesn't even indicate it. Again, this isn't any more complicated than the refraction we see on surfaces. We have absolutely no expectation that an atomic surface, that is some kind of piece of matter, has, like, this is matter on one side and this is nothing on the other side, or atmosphere. And we all know, the physicists know, that no, there's lots of stuff, energy is hitting all the time, constantly bombarding it. And there's all kinds of, like around the sun, there's a corona. There's an area around every single object that's full of stuff that in transition, half atmosphere, half pliers. That's the truth of it, okay? Even the steel, there's a layer where there's a mixture of steel atoms, and they're inside the steel there's little pieces of oxygen and nitrogen. There's a mixed layer. That's the physical fact that they're just ignoring.
Let's talk about spin, because that's in some ways a simplifying thing. An electron will essentially have two spin states, correct?
That's
Okay, so it's a made-up concept, spin. Doesn't really supposed to necessarily mean it's spinning. So they're using a fake word, again, like wave, for things that aren't waves. So they've changed the subject, and now we're not on the refraction anymore. Now we're on some sort of deflection experiment, the Stern-Gerlach. And so their foundation for this notion that electrons have spin is they observe that atoms move in a magnetic field. Now, an atom is not an electron. There's no reason to think they are electrons, that electrons and atoms are the same thing, or they behave anything like each other. So just like they turned photons into electrons and tried to pretend they're the same thing, now they're turning electrons into atoms. So again, another colossal mistake. I mean, an electron and an atom have, just by what we know, how could the elemental bit can't be the same as the big bit? It's like a human being isn't a cell. It's like, yeah, we call both of those things life, right? I'm a living thing, the cell is a living thing. Doesn't make much sense, right? Because they're alive in fundamentally completely different ways. I'm a community of cells, so I can't be the same thing because I'm a bunch of something. It has to be different because the individual cells are still individual cells. They're still in superposition. They still have their identity. They're still a thing. I can't be some kind of same thing in bigger form. I have to be something different, just as a building is not a brick. Nobody would confuse brick with building. Why are they confusing these things? It's evidence of a profound stupidity to do that.
And it's either up or down by the language.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. So you have some magnetic field and you pass an electron through it.
All right, there's no evidence that electrons are affected in any dipole way. They are, in every way, behave as magnetic monopoles. That is, they are charged negative. They have no positive charge. They cannot possibly be a dipole. They are not a dipole. They can't be, because they're already something else. They're already completely a monopole, a negative charge. Electrons are never showing their positive side. So this whole idea that they can be a dipole and turn like an atom can turn, atoms have electrons and protons. They're dipoles by definition. They have the two constituent parts. Electrons don't have the two parts. They can't possibly do what they're saying they did. There's no experiment that validates any of this.
And it will either be deflected upward or deflected downward along the axis defined by that magnetic field.
This is
So again, nonsense. I mean, electrons will be repelled by a negative field, and they'll be attracted to the positive field. You know, the energy, the magnet. That's all. There's no mysteries here at all. All right. Again, this is just nonsense to say they turn or do any of that kind of crap. They don't do any of it. It doesn't happen.
again a situation in which you pin the electron down and it either has to be up or down.
That's right.
And it's the act of observation that makes it up.
So again, they never observed this with electrons. They only observed it with atoms that are dipoles, and they don't even these experiments, these Stern-Gerlach experiments with these heated atoms that they eject from a heated material with a velocity. The reasoning they have isn't the only reasoning possible for why some go up and some go down in a mixed magnetic field. They've deliberately created a non-linear field, a field that has a bunch of change in it. And then they're surprised that the atoms don't all behave the same when you put them through different fields. I mean, this is the simple answer is you're shooting the objects through a field that has dramatic changes in it. And then you're surprised that the outcome is that some go up and some go down. There's no surprise.
Up or down.
Yep, exactly.
Prior to that, it was in superposition. Could you explain what superposition is, both when we're talking about spin and also when we're talking about location?
The idea of the superposition is the electron is in every possible position.
All right, so again, this is nothing to do with the original use of the word superposition. The original use was just to point out that, again, that light bulbs function independently. If I have a green light bulb and a blue light bulb and a yellow light bulb, I can shine them all, and yes, you'll get the idea of a mixture, but nothing mixed. You're still getting a certain amount of blue, a certain amount of red, and a certain amount of yellow. There's nothing mixed. Nothing got mixed. Nothing got changed. The red is doing exactly what the red was doing. The yellow will do exactly what the yellow would do if there was nobody else there. And the blue will do exactly what the blue will do if no one else was there. Just like the moon's gravity and the earth's gravity and the sun's gravity is exactly the way it would be even if the earth and the moon and all the other things weren't there. They do their own thing. Okay, the surface of the sun's gravity is exactly the same whether the earth is there or the moon's there. It just doesn't change until they cross a threshold where the two things become the same thing. As long as they're separate objects, they have a separate emission.
That's what it means to say the electron has a wave function. These are supposed to be two synonymous ways of speaking. You might say there's a wave function, I could calculate the probability of observing the electron there, or I could say the electron is in a superposition of every possible.
Right, so you could just make up stuff. You could say, I can't see the electron, but I can surmise that yes, it has a position and a velocity. But I can't see it, so I can't tell. But there's just no reason for me to think that because I can't see it, it means it's in all those positions. Just as there's no reason to think that, like when our eyes fail at a distance and things start moving, getting fuzzy, that somehow the thing started moving and getting fuzzy. No, my detector is creating that illusion. It's not there. It's not something actually being created. The object isn't actually getting, disappearing. So if something's fading because of distance, it's getting dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. I should believe it actually disappeared because I can't see it. That should be the way I should do my reasoning. That's how bad this is. It's just as bad as somebody saying, well, we're getting further and further away from the lighthouse and I don't see the light anymore. the lighthouse went out. It's just as bad as that. If that was your navigator on your boat, would you give him 227 thumbs up for that kind of brilliant thinking? I don't think you would. If your life depended on it, if your surgeon said that to you, oh yeah, light bulbs disappear when you walk away from them. If that's what your surgeon said, would you sit there and let him cut you open?
Position.
It's in all of those positions at once.
That's right. It's in some of them more
Than others.
That means there's more probability for seeing it there.
And note,
And again, I'm not arguing that this probability fact is all we got. We have to accept the fact that we can't nail it down. So we have to accept that for the best we can do is say, yes, if I shoot 1 million of these, every one of these locations will be filled by probability. But I can't tell where each one went because I can't see them. But I do know that they either went here, here, or here, and that they do it by a certain amount. Just as I pointed out, the refraction argument. The ones getting bent more are more unlikely. So if bending meant you had to hit something and you went 5 degrees, and if you hit 2 things you went 10 degrees, and if you hit 3 things you went 15 degrees. If it was that simple, you'd be able to figure this out, that, oh yeah, there's more things that go 5 degrees because it's more likely you hit 1, and it's less likely you hit 2, and it's even less likelier that you hit 3, like winning 3 lotteries or something. It just doesn't happen as often. Yeah, that doesn't mean that each event wasn't a real event. That doesn't mean that each lottery ticket was a real ticket.
notionally, before we measure the spin of the electron, it's neither up nor down.
Just like we expressed the wave function of the electron.
So again, that was a false statement right there. Because even when they do the experiment, it's not like it's neither up or down. It's always something. So even that was sort of bullshit. You can just have half up, half down. You can have a mixture and call that neither up or down. But each individual one is either one or the other.
As saying to every possible position we could observe, is it a probability? It's much simpler when we only think of the spin, because there's an infinite number of answers we could get to the position of the electron.
Yes.
But there's only 2 answers.
So again, more nonsense. There's an infinite number. No, there isn't. And again, this whole spin argument, there's no facts, no evidence, no experiment demonstrating this is at all a property of electrons, that they have anything called dipole functions, that they can in any way be positive and negative. It's idiotic.
Answers we can get to the question, what do we observe the spin to be? So the so-called wave function for the spin of the electron is just a number associated with spin up and a separate number associated with spin down.
And is it?
And there's just no evidence that they have such an electron that is spinning up or spinning down. It's just garbage. Again, just made up. And made up based on an experiment for which there's very little detail about doing the experiment in different ways, what are the consequences of creating different filters, doing different things, just nothing. I would show you the experiment, but there's absolutely no video of anyone ever doing the experiment. There's no images. There's no 1956 experiment. There's nothing. There's absolutely zero information, any detailed information on this experiment. And yet they're talking about it as if we know all this stuff, when they don't know any of this stuff. Know it for good reason. They believe it, but they don't believe it for any good reason.
50-50 generally?
No,
50%?
we can do whatever we want.
Before it goes through the magnet that causes it to make a choice, could you say?
Again, the magnet doesn't cause anything to make a choice. The magnetic field is with V's inside of each other. It's a complex magnetic field. It's not some kind of simple magnetic field that's making some sort of choice. It's causing the effect. The complex field that you're putting the thing in is causing the effect. Clearly.
These electrons here are 90% likely to be up and 10% likely to be down, where those are 90% likely to be down and 10% likely to be up.
Yeah, we can prepare electrons in whatever wave functions we...
Right, we can prepare atoms. They can't prepare any electrons. So again, this is just more nonsense. You can obviously orient ferrous material. You can take iron filings and line them up, have them all standing on top of their heads or tails. You can do that with dipole magnets. You can do that with dipole atoms. You can't do that with electrons. So again, this is just made up. Alright, I don't see any need to go any further. I've already demonstrated the fact that this whole quantum mechanics wooey nonsense is all based on a bunch of imagination, not evidence. It's essentially all just made up, like dark matter. It's just something they make up. But what if there was? What if there was a God? What if there is a boogeyman? What if Sasquatch is, what if there are aliens? What if that's all they're doing here? It doesn't have anything to do with anything rational. It doesn't have anything to do with recognizing the evidence completely. It's just like when people talk about life in the universe and say, well, there's just so many stars, there has to be other living things and blah, 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 when they have no evidence that the actual process of evolving into a replicating molecule even happens routinely. There's only one kind of life on planet Earth made of one set of biological arrangement of amino acids. The whole planet is covered like a junkyard, covered with these amino acids, and yet only one arrangement ever worked. One. And there's no evidence it happened twice. There's no evidence that a second evolution took place inside a cave somewhere, or inside a vent, or any of that stuff. Nothing. No evidence whatsoever that this happens routinely, and yet people keep talking as if it does. I mean, it's all just fake science. It has no discipline. And worse, it prefers silly answers. Clearly, the preferences make the silly answer work somehow. Make a silly answer. The sillier, the better. It seems a clear bias. That's what sells. Silly. Clearly, that's what's going on here. The simple explanation, no, we hate those. We hate simple explanations. We want the fancy, bizarre, wooey, fake, magical answer. And these are supposed to be intelligent people. They went to college. They might as well have gone to the popery. They're just religious kooks. This is just terrible. So depressing. So that's enough. Your people are just belligerently fools, dupes, ignorant, lying fuckheads. Yeah. Why do I bother? Fuck.